Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to our Aftermath webinar series. We're really excited to be here today, and we have a very special guest that we're delighted to welcome back to the University of Virginia. Today, we're going to cover a range of topics around election security, litigating the election, and public response to the election as well. So let me quickly introduce our guests and hand it over to my co-host, Melody Barnes, to walk us through the program. Michael Gilbert is the Martha Lubin Karsh and Bruce Karsh Bicentennial Professor of Law at the UVA Law School, and he directs the law school's Center for Public Law and Political Economy. He's also part of UVA's Democracy Initiative's Corruption Lab, and he's an expert on campaign finance law and campaign and election law, among other things. Sid Milkis is the Miller Center's White Burkett Miller Professor of Government and Foreign Affairs, and in the Department of Politics, the Cavaliers' Distinguished Teaching Professor. He is quite simply the leading professor in the United States on the presidency. He, along with Mike Nelson, has the top-selling textbook on the presidency, and he covers it from top to bottom, including things like social movements, which is the topic of the presidency and social movements is the topic of his most recent book. And then finally, our special guest, a UVA law graduate, is Janet Napolitano. She's a professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. She just finished serving as the 20th president of the University of California System, the nation's largest public research university with 10 campuses, 5 medical centers, 3 affiliated national labs, and a statewide agricultural and natural resources program. Before doing that, she was the Secretary of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013. She's a former 2-term governor of Arizona, a former Attorney General of Arizona, and a former U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona. She also is the co-director of an initiative with 3 other former directors of Homeland Security, 2 Republicans and 1 other Democrat, called Citizens for a Strong Democracy, with whom the Miller Center has been really blessed to partner in this post-election period. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Melody Barnes, my co-host, and who is the co-director of the UVA Democracy Initiative, as well as the leader in this Institute of Democracy Aftermath programming. So Melody, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. It is a pleasure to partner with you and support the work of the Institute of Democracy. And it's just fantastic to be here with this panel and a former Obama colleague. So we are looking forward to the conversation. As we all know, it's been 3 days and the counting continues and the results are almost complete, or are they? What we know is that former Vice President Biden now holds a lead in Pennsylvania, in Arizona, in Nevada, and a squeaker, almost a dead heat in Georgia. And this evening, he plans to address the nation. At the same time, President Trump has told his aides that he wants to press on for a few more weeks. And we also know that the GOP has asked the Supreme Court to block some votes in Pennsylvania. We also know that there's going to be a recount in Georgia. Could the outstanding votes, the litigation, the recounts, could any of that change the trajectory of what we know now? And what does all of this mean for the transition, for the presidency, for the political parties, and importantly, most importantly, for the cares and the concerns of Americans? That's what we want to talk about this afternoon. And to do so, I'm going to start to engage the panel. But I'm going to also ask the members of the audience to share your questions with us, put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will weave those questions into our conversation over the course of the next hour. So I want to start out with Secretary Napolitano. Again, welcome back to UVA, to your alma mater.
Thank you.
And in past years, we know that that refrain has been Florida, Florida, Florida. This year, Florida was called early. We knew that the answer to that story on election night. And at the same time, we don't know who's going to be the president for the next 4 years. And instead, the refrain has been Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia. Maybe not as catchy, but certainly really, really interesting. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what you think is going to happen in those states, given where we are, and most importantly, given your experience as former governor, former attorney general in Arizona, give us a bird's eye view into what's happening in Arizona right now.
Well, I'll start with Arizona, which it is counting in accordance with its normal pace of counting mail ballots. Arizona has used mail ballots heavily for decades. When I was running for public office in the early 2000s, about 50 or 60% of the ballots were by mail. This election, it was north of 80%. But it's a process well known and used by both parties in Arizona. And they have their ways in terms of the count and the pace of the count. Right now, I think all of the outstanding uncounted ballots, of which I think there are about 100,000, are from Maricopa County. Maricopa County is where Phoenix is. It's home to 60% of the population of Arizona. It's by far the largest county. And I think given Biden's margin in Arizona, Trump really can't catch up. But they do need to complete the count, and they will. With respect to Pennsylvania and Georgia, I think we always knew that Pennsylvania would be a slow count. Again, in part because of when they could actually start the count in Pennsylvania. But I think given Biden's margin there, that one looks safe to call. Georgia is a nail biter.
And unexpected.
You know, what's interesting to me, yeah, an unexpected nail biter. But you know, I think if Biden carries Arizona and Nevada, he'll be at 270, unless my math is wrong. And so I don't know that he needs Pennsylvania and Georgia. Somebody may correct me on that, but it sure would be nice to have them, because that's, you know, that would respect the will of the voters in those states.
I'm curious, one more question about Arizona for you. Is there a McCain effect, do you think, that's at play in Arizona right now in terms of the voting? And there's also been a lot of attention given to the Latino vote, and certainly in South Florida, obviously an important community and diverse community in Arizona. I'm just curious, given your experience there, what you think about both of those questions.
So, you know, going back to 2016, Trump only won Arizona by 3.5 percentage points. And so it was highly predictable that it would be a battleground state in 2020. But Trump didn't do himself any favors in Arizona by continuing his criticism of John McCain. And indeed, Cindy McCain cut an ad for Trump. You know, that could have impacted some of the voters. Particularly, by the way, the registered independent voters, who were always very strong for McCain. In fact, stronger than actually the Republican voters. So, you know, that is kind of interesting. And in terms of the Latino vote, Arizona has been changing demographically a lot, and it's been changing rapidly. It used to be a pretty deep red state when I was first running in 1998, and then in 2002. As a Democrat, people looked at me askance, you know, what makes you think you can win? But the state has moved in its own way to be, I think, what we would call now a classic battleground state. And Latino vote certainly has a role there, because the percentage of the electorate that are Latino has grown. And I think the polls will show that Biden carried the Latino vote in Arizona by quite a big margin. He didn't in Florida, but it's a different Latino vote. There's not one monogamous Latino vote. I think that's a mistake people make. In South Florida, you have Cubans, you have Venezuelans. In Arizona, the primary source for Latino vote are those of Mexican heritage. So, you know, you have to look at all of these electorates differently.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. I don't know if you want to.
Michael, I'd love for you to come in here, because as we're getting down to the narrow questions of vote counting, and particularly as this is starting to work its way into the courts in one court or another, what are you watching for? What are you looking at? What seems litigatable? And I saw another UVA law graduate who is representing Vice President Biden on a lot of these cases, Bob Bauer, said that some of the claims were laughable. Are there real issues coming forward, or is this just a stall tactic and the Trump people wrapping their minds around a loss that may be coming?
So I think some of it is pretty clearly a stall tactic. There was litigation filed in Michigan, the claim from the Trump campaign being that their people had been denied access to the vote counting process. So typically states allow or even require for observers to be in the room and to watch while the votes are being counted. And the Trump campaign claimed that some of their people had been denied access. But as far as I can tell, they actually had no evidence for this. It seemed pretty clear that that case wasn't going anywhere. They were probably just trying to slow down the networks and prevent them from calling Michigan. There was a suit filed in Georgia, the claim being that some 50 ballots that should not have been counted got dumped into a bin with ballots that were to be counted, but that too was thrown out. It turned out there was really no evidence for this. The 50 ballots were placed in the bin, but it appeared that that was perfectly lawful. There's a possible challenge in Pennsylvania that could go somewhere. The central claim being that the state of Pennsylvania cannot count ballots that were mailed by Election Day, but that arrived in the few days after. And there's a lot of legal weeds here, but the basic idea would be you can't do that and you shouldn't count those ballots. The problem there is, we'll see if the numbers hold up. It looks like even without those ballots, Biden would be ahead in Pennsylvania. So even if they brought that suit and succeeded, which might be a long shot, it's not clear that it would change any outcomes.
Can I just pause on that? So Pennsylvania has been segregating those that arrive before or on Election Day or before, separate from those that arrive after Election Day.
Yes, that's right. So there was some litigation around this question in the run-up to the election, and elections officials in Pennsylvania, I suspect fearing that this litigation could rear its head again after the fact, segregated the ballots coming in late, just in case a court tells them they can't count those.
And do we know if the current totals in Pennsylvania include the after Election Day ballots or not?
My understanding is that those after Election Day ballots have not been counted yet, but don't hold me to that. Things are changing quickly.
Go ahead, Mel.
No, go ahead, Ben. I was just going to ask, kind of following up on this, given the recounts, given the litigation, if former Vice President Biden hits 270, and Pennsylvania would do that, what does that mean for those recounts? What does that mean for the litigation? And I think that ties into one of the questions from our audience. When is it appropriate for a campaign to declare victory, to say, I'm the winner, I am still the president, or I am the next president-elect?
Well, it isn't really official until January, when the votes in the Electoral College are recorded in the Congress. And if we work backwards from that, it becomes a little closer to official in December, when the Electoral College itself meets and the votes are cast. Until then, it's frequently the case that campaigns declare victory, but that's just based often on unofficial vote totals in their sense that the other side can't catch up. And my suspicion is that the Biden campaign is very soon going to declare victory. Whether that's appropriate or not, or they should wait longer, I'm not sure. Regardless of whether they declare victory now or later, these recounts could proceed. And it seems to me that if I was a member of the Trump campaign, the the most plausible route forward to changing the trajectory of this election is through recounts. So the good news for the Trump campaign is that in a number of states, the vote totals, as they stand right now anyway, are sufficiently close that they can ask for a recount, or state law even requires it. So I'm thinking here of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada. Last time I checked, the difference between the candidates was less than half a percentage point or less than 1 percentage point. And it is possible for a recount to actually change the outcome of an election. So a somewhat recent and famous example of this came out of the Senate race in Minnesota in 2008. Some people will remember this. After the initial count, the Republican Norm Coleman was ahead by about 200 votes. And after the recount, the Democrat Al Franken actually pulled it off and won the election. But here's the bad news for the Trump campaign. The numbers from that Minnesota recount are pretty typical. Recounts tend to move, 50, 100, a few hundred votes around. As you go back through the ballots, you discover a little error here, a clerical problem there. The machine counted this ballot one way, but when a human being looks at it, you realize it should have been counted another way. Trump's behind in most of these states by more than a few hundred votes. So last I checked, he was down in Pennsylvania by 13,000, in Wisconsin by 20,000. The probability of a recount moving that many votes in a single state is very low. The probability of a recount moving that many votes in enough states for this to come out the other way, exceedingly low.
May I interject a moment? I think that's totally right about the recounts, that they are very low probability episodes, and you have to be really, really close because they don't move all that many votes. In terms of declaring a winner, one other thing I think that candidates traditionally look at is when the AP calls the race. And it traditionally, there was just the AP as a source. Now Fox has its own source, so there are two, but I think many times that's used as a definitive, even while the final counting gets completed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, as Mike was saying, there's there's what happens officially in December and January, but to what you were saying, Secretary Napolitano, there are also these customs and norms that we have used over time based on what sites like AP are telling us. And I think also the other side calling to accept and say, I concede, that have shaped our politics.
Not sure we're going to see that this time, which has an impact on transition, which I think we're going to talk about later, right?
Absolutely. Sid, why don't we bring you into this conversation as well? And I know one of the things that had concerned people going into this election, I know Secretary Napolitano and other former secretaries at DHS have been concerned about this, was the protests, the possibility for violence, and those kinds of concerns. And there certainly have been some protests around Portland and Minneapolis and Detroit, and people on both sides. Now, one of the refrains from the right has been that the election was stolen. At the same time, we think back to 2000, and certainly we were hearing similar kinds of concerns from the left as well. And I'm wondering, do you see the concerns, the angst around this election, what was happening, what was being said in 2000, are those two sides of the same coin, or are we talking about two different things?
Yeah, 2000, I was involved in a lot of discussions like this in 2000, and it just seems so different. I mean, then the parties were not nearly as polarized as they are now. They didn't, each side didn't view the other as an existential threat. And the differences between Al Gore and George W. Bush, although important, there was a lot of common ground there. And there was a respect for our institutions then. So although there was a great deal of discontent on the left when the Supreme Court made its decision, and some liberal activists felt, and this is the first time the Supreme Court had decided a presidential election. So it's controversial. And some people on the left felt the vote was prematurely stopped in Florida. Basically, there was respect for the decision. And it was really two battalions of lawyers battling each other. There weren't a lot of people on the streets. Now, of course, the situation is very different. The parties are deeply, deeply polarized. There's been a decline of institutions. And there is, as you said, Mel, there's a lot of activity on the streets. Thankfully, for now, it's been the demonstrations have been peaceful, and even when the two sides have confronted each other, there has not been any resort to violence. But the claims are very different. So Secretary Napolitano said before, complete the vote, and people on the left are echoing that. They're saying, count the vote, count the vote. My nephew lives in South Philly, and he said last night the demonstrations were sort of festive. The people were dancing in the streets as they yelled, count the vote. And it seems to me that shows a basic respect for our electoral process. You know, this jewel in our crown, this thing that really makes effective our commitment to popular sovereignty. And you know, if the Supreme Court steps in, as Mike suggested, there may be some issues that go to the Supreme Court. And if the Supreme Court, given the recent controversies with the court, somehow would change the verdict of this election, that could change dramatically. Mm-hmm. There could be general strikes in Philadelphia. Now, the claims on the right, it seems to me, are very different because there's a claim that the election was rigged without evidence. And the protesters in the streets claiming that all the votes counted are not legitimate are taking their cues from the president, who for months has been saying the election was rigged. And Mel, I didn't sleep last night after I heard the president's remarks, because they just struck at the heart of our electoral process. They struck at the heart of popular sovereignty. I think, I'll just say this, and I think by about 6, 7 o'clock tonight, the AP is going to declare that Biden is the winner, because I think Pennsylvania is going to come in very strong around 5 o'clock. I think it's really important for then President-elect Biden get on the TV right away. And as he's pretty good at doing, appeal for unity and express great respect for the other side. And then just suggest it's time to unify the country, because we really, we don't have violence in the streets, but our institutions are facing a crisis now. And I think remedial action has to take place right away.
Can I jump in with a question for all three of our panelists? Mm-hmm. There was a theoretical possibility that since we've been tracking this at the Miller Center for 1.5 years, including with a lot of guidance from Sid, there was a theoretical constitutional possibility that in some of the cases leading up to the election, the Supreme Court seemed to suggest, which is that state legislatures actually ultimately have control on selecting electors. And in 1876, we had rival elector ballots go in, which led to this commission that ended up picking Hayes as president. This always seemed both theoretical and in past deep in the recesses of history. But then I saw Newt Gingrich post on Twitter calling for the Pennsylvania state legislature to step in. Sean Hannity, in interviewing Lindsey Graham yesterday, they seem to embrace this idea. And then Kevin McCarthy saying, we haven't given up yet. And so I just want to ask the panelists to both reflect on the constitutionality of a state legislature stepping in at some point between now and when the Congress meets to affirm the ballots submitted by the Electoral College. Do we think this is possible? Is it constitutional? And Sid, back to your comments, what would happen in the streets if that happened?
I think you would have efforts to shut down. There would be general strikes. I'll leave the intricate constitutional issues to my fellow panelists, but all I would say is Bill, it would simply be extraordinary for the Pennsylvania legislature to appoint an alternative set of electors. That has not happened since 1876. And I don't think we want to go back to that dark period of our history at the twilight of Reconstruction. So I think that is very unlikely to happen unless the vote in Pennsylvania is going to be a lot closer than I'm pretty sure it's going to be. And I think those electors will be certified by the governor, and they will be cast in the state and then counted in the Congress. And Bill, I've been looking for. I think it's really important. I said before, I think former Vice President Biden needs to get on TV as soon as possible. I'm looking for responsible Republican leadership to lower the temperature. And I was relieved this morning to see Senator Pat Toomey, a respected Republican in Pennsylvania, said it was hard to watch the president's remarks last night and believes that there's nothing fraudulent about the Pennsylvania voting. And I'd like to see more Republicans step up in this way. But I think it's particularly important that some of the Republicans in Pennsylvania are withstanding these really, really, really dangerous and irresponsible incitements.
Maybe I'll just pick up and make a couple of comments. I share Sid's view that it would be politically very damaging, and it's also politically very unlikely that the Pennsylvania legislature would try to appoint its own electors. Just today, Republican leaders in the Pennsylvania legislature came out and said, we will not do that. Now, talk is cheap, and we'll see what happens in the weeks ahead, but I took that as an encouraging sign. On the legal question, there are lots of details here, but I'll try to restrain myself and keep it brief. Article 2 of our Constitution, in fact, says that the electors shall be appointed by state legislatures. And it's this language in the Constitution that provides the hook that some of these people on the right are trying to rely upon and make the argument that state legislatures could override the votes in these states and just appoint their own slates. I should say, too, it's that piece of the Constitution that state legislatures have relied on when they pass laws that say, however the vote comes out in our state, will dictate how these electors will vote in the Electoral College. I mean, it's that constitutional hook that empowers the legislature to do this. So legally, could a legislature try to override its existing laws that say how these electors will be allocated and select a new slate? Maybe, but lots and lots of tricky issues would bloom. For example, can the legislature act without the governor's input? I mean, the typical way we make laws is through bicameralism and presentments. Does the constitutional text X the governor out? If the governor has to be included, well, this is not going to work in Pennsylvania then. So there are lots of questions that would have to be sorted, but there is at least a kind of thread there that if you're sufficiently desperate, you could grasp at.
Yeah, I mean, there are several questions, I know one, Secretary Napolitano, you all have been doing some polling, trying to get a sense of the public, just as I understand it, on the level of trust around these elections, how Americans are feeling about these elections. I don't know if there's any of that information that you want to share with us, because I think what we're talking about now speaks to this issue of trust, the sense of legitimacy that not only is important with regard to the election itself, but critically in the weeks and months and years to come, how people respond to the person that sits in the White House, respond to the laws and policies that are passed. The ability to govern is shaped by this. And I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to share.
Sure. Yeah, sure. So our group, Citizens for a Strong Democracy, which is led by 4 former secretaries of Homeland Security, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. We were in the field yesterday, last night, and just got some results before this panel. And a couple things really stood out. One is that voters, by and large, Biden and Trump voters, believe that votes should be counted in accord with state law. So if the state law says that it can be up to 3 days after the election, those votes should be counted. Another thing that voters who responded to the poll by and large agree on, Biden and Trump voters, is that the most trusted source for running an election, conducting an election, announcing the results of an election are the local election officials, and they get a high degree of trust. There is also a very, very strong agreement that violence should never be condoned. Even if your candidate lost, that you would accept the results of the election. And there's also a very strong agreement about having a smooth transition of power, should there need to be a transition of power. So those are some fundamentals, but we thought, given just the climate out there and all the noise that's going back and forth, et cetera, it would be good to kind of test and see whether any of this was cutting through. They're on the edges, it is, but those fundamentals seem to be holding very, very strongly.
So maybe that's
at least according to that one poll that was done immediately in the aftermath of the election.
That's a great transition to the transition. Presumably at some point we're going to know who the next president is, and it looks like it's moving toward Vice President Biden. So Secretary Napolitano, you've been there for transitions. You've seen what they're like. There's so many different dimensions to them. There's being conferred as the president-elect, which is actually both a technical process and an informal process, right? He will at some point be declared by the media, not by the government, because the media will announce him to be the president-elect before the Electoral College meets, presumably, and votes. But once that happens, it triggers a whole number of different things actually by law, right? He can start forming, transitions teams have already been formed, but landing teams can go into agencies, can start meeting with the agencies. And then there's the whole thinking about the actual transfer of power on Inauguration Day. So can you walk us through some of that from your perspective? What actually happens and what's important in being named president-elect?
So taking over as president is an immense undertaking. For example, there are some 4,000 positions that are presidentially appointed, and you need to have at least some of those ready to go, because you need your cabinet and your important agency heads ready to go into office, so that you're not by yourself. So let me describe the Bush to Obama transition in 2008, which I thought actually went very well. And it went very well because outgoing President Bush helped make it so. He made it a big value in his administration, directed all of his cabinet, agency directors, et cetera, to prepare materials for the incoming administration, to meet with the so-called landing teams. Landing teams are groups that go into agencies and kind of take the initial handoff. Get the initial, where they are in the budget process, what are key personnel working on? What initiatives are underway? What deadlines do they need to be informed? What litigation or regulatory deadlines may be pending? All the kinds of nuts and bolts. And the landing team goes in, and if they're working cooperatively with an outgoing administration, they get that information. And so because President Bush directed that his administration invest in transition, it actually went fairly smoothly. I was named in December after the election as the incoming Secretary of Homeland Security. And we actually had some joint security briefings and tabletop exercises in the White House complex well before the inauguration. I was taking over from Michael Chertoff as Secretary of Homeland Security, and I was serving as governor of Arizona. So it was difficult for me to be in DC during this whole transition period because I had another job, and I wasn't going to give up that job until I was actually confirmed to be secretary.
And we all weren't working by Zoom at that point.
And we all weren't working by Zoom. So Chertoff had materials prepared for me and had the materials sent out to Phoenix, and then sent some of his key personnel out to Phoenix to meet with me. I remember peeking outside the door of my office, and I saw a guy coming down the hallway with a dolly that was filled from bottom to rim with these 3-inch binders. They were all briefing materials from the Department of Homeland Security. I was like, what have I done?
Just to prep you for your Miller Center oral history, because when we do it, you're going to get a stack of binders, which is, what did you do? And that's going to prep you for your oral history. Just warning.
Oh my heavens. No. Anyway, the other, so there was a lot of exchange of information underway in December through the holidays, early January, and so forth. Remember, the country was in a deep recession, on the brink of a depression, and so it was a very tenuous period. Another thing that happened was President Obama had basically named his cabinet well before the inauguration, but he can't formally nominate his cabinet until he's actually the president. And so a process was set up whereby the nominees to be actually met with the key committee members of the Senate committee that their confirmation would go through in early January. And then on the day of the inauguration, after the inauguration, there's a luncheon in the Capitol. And it's the president, the vice president, the outgoing president, vice president, and spouses, and then the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader of the Senate, et cetera, and the incoming cabinet. And after the luncheon, we went down to watch the parade. And while we were watching the parade, the Senate reconvened, the committees convened, actually received the nomination paperwork. They passed on the nominations, and then they immediately were able to go to the floor of the Senate, and we were getting confirmed. And so as we were watching the parade, every 20 minutes or so, a Marine would come down and tap one of us on the shoulder and say, "You've been confirmed," and then go in and come back in another 20 minutes or so, "You've been confirmed." So there was
We're waiting for those shoulder taps.
Indeed. One last thing I'll report, because this answer has been pretty long. Homeland Security has a very important role for the security for events like inaugurations, also things like Super Bowls, big national, they're called national security events. there was actually a pretty active threat stream against the Obama inauguration in January of '09. So Chertoff and I agreed that while I would be confirmed, I would not actually take my oath until at least 24 hours after the inauguration, in the off chance that that threat actually manifested itself, and in the desire to avoid a change of command right in the middle of a major security incident. So he was in the command center while I was going through all the inauguration festivities. But that's what can happen when you have two administrations that are working closely with each other. In the instance where administrations are not working together, it's much more difficult. I think that the Biden folks are already thinking through how they do the transition with cooperation a la Bush, with something less than Bush Obama, or with actual kind of quiet opposition. Yeah.
We've already almost lost a week from election day. I mean, it's been 3 days, but it may be through the weekend before, if it ends up being Vice President Biden, he is named president-elect. If the numbers narrow and it goes in either direction, that's cutting into this 78, 79-day period between election day and inauguration day. What are the consequences of that? Does it slow down both sides in their behind the scenes planning? Can they just still do this work anyway without knowing if they win? Or is there something magical that happens when we know? Or is it that handoff?
A lot of the work is underway and will be underway. Because as you know, there's really very little time to get all of this done. And there are nuts and bolts. People have to get security clearances, for example. So that process needs to be undertaken. You can't wait until the results of the electoral college votes are accepted by the Congress in what, January, Michael? Yeah, if you wait till then, you're really in a hole. So that work is underway. You know, at some point, and there's actually a statute now that governs transitions. And at some point, the statute says, from the statutory standpoint, not the practical standpoint, when the transition begins. And at that point, there's actually money that's made available to the incoming team. But I'm confident that Biden, just as Obama did, has already has a team and has taken some of his campaign funds and, you know, put that so that the money part can go ahead and get started.
I want to steer a question to Sid and Melody, Michael, and Secretary Napolitano. Please feel free to jump in. Sid, the longer this goes, does it provide cast a shadow on the honeymoon period, particularly if it's a Vice President Biden, if this becomes really contested and drawn out? And twinned with that, it appears that we're going to have divided government. It looks like the Senate will remain Republican. In fact, it's almost certain. Talk a little bit about what you expect going forward if Vice President Biden is indeed the president-elect, given those two things happening at the same time. And Mel, I would, well, all of the panelists, but would welcome your regards, particularly sitting in the White House thinking about policy initiatives you might want to move forward.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I'm anxious to hear what the other panelists say. But you know, Bill, as your question implies, it could be really rough sledding. You know, given how polarized the political system is now, we don't have honeymoon periods anymore. I think Melody and Secretary Napolitano can tell you, President Obama didn't really have much of a honeymoon period, and certainly President Trump did not. And unless both these runoffs in Georgia are won by Democrats, then the start of the administration is going to depend on a relationship between Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell. And the shoulder taps might be very much delayed, the confirmation of cabinets. And so I think there's going to be a lot of focus on staffing the executive office of the president. Many of the appointments there do not require Senate confirmation, and that may lead to a centralization of policymaking that may look more efficient, but is also more controversial, I think. So I mean, this kind of commitment to administrative action and a centralization of power in the White House might be a consequence of the kind of difficult start to this system of divided government. But finally, I've just been digging into this relationship, and I heard that Biden and McConnell actually are friends, that they get along, that Senator McConnell was the only Republican senator to attend Beau Biden's funeral in 2015. And by his very nature, Biden is, likes to bargain, is pragmatic. So it may not be as bad as I'm making it sound. But there's certainly, I think, Bill, reason to be concerned.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things. One, to Sid's point, what President Obama had those first couple of years was a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. And even with that, there's still diversity among Democrats. There are obviously very liberal Democrats, and there are Democrats that are quite moderate as well. And even with that, there were a lot of challenges in moving an agenda forward. Once that majority was lost, it became even more challenging. And that was mixed with the fact from the beginning that Senator McConnell said that his goal was to make President Obama a one-term president. And so the objections and from our perspective, the recalcitrance, even as we were trying to build in Republican ideas into the policymaking process, meant that it was hard to move an agenda. Now, divided government happens. President George W. Bush had, there was a 50-50 Senate until Jim Jeffords moved and caucus outside of the Republican Party. And President George W. Bush started out with No Child Left Behind and an olive branch and an extended hand to Senator Kennedy, who also extended a hand to him in an effort to try and get something done. 9/11 happened, which obviously dramatically shaped and reshaped the legislative process and lawmaking process, although it also created the Department of Homeland Security. So divided government isn't something that's unusual, but I think what makes this particular period an unusual one is, as Sid said, the growing polarization, the growing calcification, the hardening of lines that exist. And I think it also raises a question that came from one of our audience members about the splitting of tickets and what we think about the fact that there were people who voted against President Trump, but voted for Republicans down the line. What is that telling us about how people are thinking about it? I don't know if people are necessarily thinking about it as a whole and thinking about it strategically, but it certainly is an expression of their desires, their interests. And I don't know if any of our panelists want to address the issue of ticket splitting and what that might mean, not only to policy making, but also what that means to the parties.
Well, I can only speculate, but I think some voters may indeed have been swayed by arguments that if only one party was in charge of Washington, D.C., they would go crazy. And so you needed to have, if you're going to vote for a Democrat to be president, you needed to have a Republican's Senate and or House to be a check. Some voters may have believed that, and also maybe a reflection that people generally, may know their senators or their congressperson better, and so even if that person is of a different party than who they prefer as president, they'll make that choice. So. Yeah, I think, Mel, it can be just a lot of different things. People have been ticket splitters for a long time.
Michael, I'd like to bring it back to you. We've got about 10 minutes left, and there are a couple of questions in from the audience, and they go to legal issues. And Secretary Napolitano is a former U.S. attorney and attorney general from your state. I would love your perspective on these as well. And Mel, a lawyer too. I keep having to remind myself. So one is, what can stop the Biden train moving forward, Michael? As you look at the legality, at both the legal issues and the constitutional issues of the Electoral College convening, Congress accepting the ballots of the Electoral College, do you think there are real station stops that could stop this train? And then B, what are the personal legal liabilities of the president moving forward? Could we imagine him? There are a whole bunch of charges, including, if one reads the Mueller investigation report carefully, some fact patterns that might lead to civil or criminal litigation, probably criminal litigation for obstruction of justice in the federal context. There are state cases out there. From a legal standpoint, what are the stops along the way, both for potentially a president-elect Biden and a former President Trump?
Well, I have some things to say about the first question. I'm not so sure about the second. What could stop the train? I suppose if the Trump campaign calls for enough recounts and there's a miracle and the votes move around in the other direction, I suppose he could win. The probability of that seems very low. There is an outside chance of the faithless elector problem. So here's the idea: if, for example, Joe Biden wins Pennsylvania, according to state law, those 20 electors from Pennsylvania are supposed to vote for him in the Electoral College, but one or more of them could act faithlessly and actually vote for Donald Trump. And from time to time in our history, we have had faithless electors, but so far, maybe Sid can correct me if there's an old instance that I've forgotten, but as far as I know, no faithless elector has ever changed the outcome of the race. And if Biden maintains his lead in a number of these states so that the vote in the Electoral College isn't that close, then even if there are a handful of faithless electors, the probability of that mattering is very low.
But just to pause on that for 1 second, until Pennsylvania's lead started widening, the math did line up that if Arizona and Nevada went Biden and Pennsylvania and Georgia went Trump, you would be right on 270, and all it would take is one faithless elector to create quite a, I won't use the expletive deleted here, but a show that would be pretty challenging for the country.
Yeah.
Yes, and it seems to me it would invite all kinds of strategizing behind the scenes because, you might want to, well, you can imagine all the possibilities. Part of it's going to depend on the sequence in which the votes in the Electoral College are revealed in the Congress. If I think you're going to vote faithlessly at time 2, I might try to move the other direction at time 1. It could be complicated. So I do think that if, assuming Biden wins, I'm hopeful for exactly this reason, that he wins by enough that it isn't much of an issue or doesn't threaten much of an issue. The last thing I'll say on the legal front, were it possible for the president or his team to actually generate some kind of evidence, literally any evidence of fraud in this election, then you could get remedies, including a do-over election in this or that state or the other. Now, that kind of remedy is exceedingly rare. It's almost never ordered, but it could happen. But of course, the problem he and his team face is, despite all of the red-faced allegations, they have no evidence. As far as I can tell, literally zero, not a single instance yet. And unless and until they produce that evidence, those claims are not going to, they're not going to stop the train. And I don't think that evidence is forthcoming. On the second question of what could the president's personal liability be, I just have to pass on this one. There's a chance, I know about one issue which has to do with campaign finance. Some of you will remember this controversy over the payment to Stormy Daniels. that might in fact amount to a campaign finance violation. It's not clear because the law here is vague and there's wiggle room. It is possible when he steps down, something could happen there. Past that, I'm afraid it's outside my expertise.
Melody, Secretary Napolitano on that issue? Because and one of the reasons it's relevant in this context is there is a lot of speculation that if there's legal liability, if the president's facing legal liability, that may be another reason for him to not leave office if the election goes against him, right? He'd rather have the law on his side rather than being on the other side of the table looking at legal forces.
Well, you know, if he doesn't win the election, which he hasn't and he won't, you know, Joe Biden's going to get sworn in on January the 20th. There will be a new president. So the immunities that he enjoys as president go away. That's a different issue than whether any kind of federal charge exists or should be pursued, which is a legal issue, but also a very political question. We do know that there's some state matters pending, and the issue of subpoenas, et cetera, has been up and back and forth to the U.S. Supreme Court. That may be a time when the federal government defers to the state. And then, of course, we have the issue of his tax payment. If this infamous audit is complete and he has to repay the federal government, and he has quite a few outstanding debts. So he's going to have some interesting times.
Yeah, I will just say, echoing what Secretary Napolitano said, that I think a number of people have an eye on New York State and Cy Vance, and that is probably a set of significant concerns for President Trump after he is out of the White House. And the litigation that's taken place in New York and the case that Vance seems to be mounting hasn't gone away. The litigation hasn't taken that off the table. And I think he's looking at that without any possible kind of recourse that might exist on the federal level.
Great. So as we try to wrap this up now, we've got 3 minutes left from our three guests, and Mel, I'm going to obviously want your take on this as well. So if we go over a minute, that's okay. What are you looking at most carefully in the next, say, 2 weeks between now and Thanksgiving? What is most important to happen from your perspectives?
Could take 3 minutes deciding who's going to go first here. So, you know, Bill, I was asked in an interview a couple of days, what is my hope that'll come out of this election? And I said, a peaceful transfer of power. We've had such a thing since 1800 when Thomas Jefferson was able to assume the office peacefully in spite of a bitter conflict, and said in his inaugural address, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. And, you know, I was comforted to see that the Secret Service has already cleared an airspace over President Biden's house, and there's now Secret Service as a side, because it was a sign that the transition, you know, there's procedures that are going to take place in spite of all the very, very nasty rhetoric and potential danger. But President Trump, I think, is the first president to really say that he might not accept a peaceful transfer of power. And also, this is the first controversial election, Bill, where we have an incumbent president. And so I just want to see a transition that is peaceful and some hope that the wounds in our democracy can be repaired.
Secretary Napolitano?
One thing that I'm going to be looking for is if President Trump continues with the same kind of rhetoric he used yesterday at the White House, whether prominent Republicans start speaking out and themselves reassuring the public that their election was not subject to the kind of widespread fraud that is being alleged, that the will of the voters will be honored, and that they expect the president to execute a peaceful transfer of power, as have all his predecessors. But I think we need to hear more Republican voices now.
So I'll just echo my co-panelists. I would have said the very same things. I'm very hopeful for a peaceful transition, and very, very hopeful that Republicans in particular will assure the public that there's no evidence of fraud. Our systems are not perfect, but they're very good, and this election is legitimate, and we should have faith in the system.
And I will say, before asking you the same question, Bill, that I completely agree with the members of the panel. I think everything that's been said speaks to the importance of protecting the integrity of the American democracy. And then as a result of that, then I would also hope to see the steps that are necessary to, as that transition of power takes place, as the votes thus far indicate that it will, that we start to move to a new administration that is also putting in place a process that they can address the cares of the American public, as they have indicated they would like to do. I mean, that is ultimately the outcome of the election. The election is a means to an end to have those that the American people want to represent them to do so, and for Americans to get a sense that this process can work and can work for them. Bill,
Well, so I'll give you I'll keep it well under a minute. I first share all of your views, and then so to only say something that complements them, that Vice President Biden and his team think about the people that I saw kneeling and praying outside polling stations that were wearing those red Make America Great hats. There are a lot of people that are going to go through a grieving process once the race has been declared for Vice President Biden. And he's done a great job talking about how he sees himself as a Democrat, but as a president of all Americans, and demonstrating that through the transition. Even if the Trump people do not cooperate with him, I think is going to be important and challenging. So with that, let me start by thanking everyone here. First, our panelists and Melody, who's taken the leadership in pulling together all of our aftermath programming. This has been really hard work, and we're at the end of a very hard week with maybe hard weeks to come. Our audience continues to grow. I get to look through to see who's out there. So many familiar names, and we're just delighted that you all have joined us for these and that we continue to grow this audience. I know we're going to be doing more programming starting on Monday at 4 o'clock. The Karsh Center on Law and Democracy at UVA is going to be doing our programming. So we're just appreciative of all of our friends and colleagues across UVA. And then finally, to the supporters of the Miller Center and the George and Judy Marcus Family Foundation that has supported all of this work. We are really appreciative that we get to do this work. And finally, to the Miller Center team and the Democracy Initiative team that have worked with faculty and fellows from across the university to do this. We couldn't do it without you. And as we go into a weekend, a well-earned break. So thanks to everyone, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.